Hey class, I want to talk a little bit about chapter 18, which is the expanding global economy, expectations and inequalities between the years 1550 and 1700. In other words, from the mid 16th century until the beginning of the 18th century. Now, what I think is most useful for us to understand, if we look at the overall theme of this chapter, we need to understand that the discovery of the Americas ignited a really significant expansion of the world economy. And in addition to expanding the world economy, it also reordered the world's economy. Although the way it reordered the world economy was not immediately obvious to everybody. At the beginning of this book, when we first started looking at chapters in this book, East Asia was the strongest part of the world economy, followed by South Asia and Western Asia, what we would call the Middle East, and also North Africa. Now, in the period that we're talking about here, from 1550 to 1700, East Asia, in particular China, is still the largest economy in the world, still the strongest economy in the world, the richest economy in the world. It is still the economy that produces the goods that most of the other major trade centers in the world want. However, the discovery of the Americas starts a dynamic that begins to move economic power towards the European countries, or what this book would refer to as far western Afro-Eurasia, the far western part of the Eastern Hemisphere, the northwestern part, which is Europe. Now, the reason it does this is that it's the European countries, they are the ones that get to the Americas. They're the ones that destroy the American empires, and they're the ones that begin to exploit the economic resources of the Americas to their advantage. Also, as we're going to see in this chapter, they begin to take advantage of the slave trading networks that already existed in sub-Saharan Africa. And in honesty, they also expand them. And they use them to their advantage in order to fill the gaps for labor that are needed in the Americas. Because during the first century or so, the Native American population comes very close to dying out because it lacks resistance to the diseases that are brought to the Americas. Because it lacks resistance to the diseases that are brought to the Americas by people from the Eastern Hemisphere. Now, the point I'm making here is that for people in East Asia, particularly in China, they didn't necessarily realize that the tables were turning and that their position ultimately would not be as strong in the world as it once was. And there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, the Chinese political ideology was that they were the Middle Kingdom. They saw themselves as the center of Earth. And from an economic standpoint, that was a reasonable assumption because they were the dominant actor in the economic world. And as I said before, they were the place where most people wanted to go to do business. Now, part of this attitude was that the Chinese did not expand. Now, if we remember in the very first chapter, we talked about how under Sheng He, the Chinese government encouraged exploration in the Indian Ocean and went as far west as East Africa and the Red Sea. And but political figures in China discouraged that. Now, on the opposite end, of course, was Europe, which was at the very western extremity of Eurasia, and which had the smallest population and the least money. And so from the standpoint of the Europeans, they had everything to gain by trying to get out and make connections in the rest of Eurasia. And also, they gained immensely by being the ones who got to the Americas and exploited the Americas. However, the process of change by our modern standards is very, very slow. It took several centuries. Nowadays, economic change can happen in a couple of decades. But at this time, it was a much slower process. But the bottom line is that everybody, all of the major trading centers had people who benefited significantly from the discovery of the Americas. Now, at the beginning of this chapter, of course, they talk about the city of Manila in the Philippines, and they talk about how the Spanish ship came from Acapulco with all the silver that had been mined in Mexico. And how with the silver, the Spanish bought all kinds of stuff. And also it talks about how much of the silver ends up in China. And, really from the standpoint of the Spanish, ultimately this wasn't a great advantage to them, because the Spanish made a lot of money and they were able to develop a large empire in the Americas. However, because the Spanish under the Habsburgs, once they came under the control of the Habsburgs, they stayed involved constantly in wars in Europe. And ultimately, although they got millions and millions and millions, billions of dollars in specie, when we use the term specie, we were referring to precious metal that is the root for monetary systems. In this case, gold and silver, or in particular, in the case of China, silver, because the Chinese economic system was based on silver. Now, in the case of the Spanish, even though they made a lot of money, even though they had a lot of money, ultimately, they did not benefit the most from this. Ultimately, the countries that benefited the most were the countries further to the north: France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. Those three countries were the countries who developed empires and developed business systems. In particular, the Dutch and the British were the ones who really modernized systems of business. For instance, the corporation as we know it today really comes into existence during this period. When people begin to invest money to buy shares in the Dutch East India Company and in the English East India Company, in order to invest in the business that these countries carried on. The British dominated South Asia, what nowadays is India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. The Dutch dominated what nowadays is Indonesia. Both of those countries became major interlocutors in the trade systems of Asia. And that money allowed them to have money to invest in other areas. Now, in particular, what we see, and I'm going to skip ahead a bit, is that they took this money that they were making in Asia, they invested back in the Americas, but they also were able to get goods that they got in Asia, and also goods that they created back home in their own countries. And they were able to sell these goods in Africa. And this is very significant because, going back to what I said earlier, Africa ended up being the country that provided the labor that allowed for much of the successful exploitation of the Americas. And in particular, Africans provided the workforce that was able to work in plantation economies. Now, as the chapter mentions, Africans worked in other capacities too, before the plantation economies really got going, because it took about a century or so for the plantation economies to really get, really be productive. And before that time, Africans worked as urban slaves. Africans worked in mining. Africans worked, had a number of jobs. And also, as the book mentions, there were significant numbers of Africans in Europe itself. Portugal itself had about 10,000, Lisbon, the capital, had about 10,000 African slaves in the 16th century. And also there were Africans working, for instance, in Sao Tome, the previously uninhabited island off the coast of what now is Angola. This chapter didn't mention it, but Cape Verde, for instance, which is off the coast of what nowadays is Senegal. The Portuguese occupied that and put Africans there. And so we see that Africans, were working in all these areas. But basically, Europeans, they realized that they needed workforce, and they were able to get people from Africa. Now, the question that people always ask, and the authors talk about this a bit too, the question that students tend to ask a lot is, why did black people sell black people? And there's a couple of answers to that. There's a couple of reasons for that. I say, first of all, in the minds of Africans, they didn't necessarily see themselves as black people. I mean, they realized they were black. They realized that they were much darker than these people who were coming there in ships. They realized that they were darker than the people who came from the north through the desert. But their identity didn't revolve around the skin color. I mean, they saw themselves as nationalities. I mean, if you went to the Asante Kingdom in the late 17th century, people would have said they were Asante. If you went to Oyo in the 17th or in the 18th or the 19th century, people would have said they were Yoruba. And it's interesting, like the week I'm doing this lecture is the week after that movie, The Woman King, has come out. And it talks about Benin, Dahomey, what nowadays is the country of Benin, but back in those days was Dahomey. And it talks about the movie The Woman King. It talks about the women soldiers of that country who, now the movie, I haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure the movie takes an artistic license with it. But there were women soldiers in Dahomey. That is real. That they actually existed. But people would have seen themselves as Dahomians. That's how they would have identified themselves. Blackness was not something that would have been their identifier. And in places where people were Africans who were Muslims, say for instance, in the interior of West Africa, in the Hausa areas or places like Songhai that was mentioned in the previous chapter, people would refer to themselves, they would have seen Islam as the thing that distinguished them from their neighbors who weren't Muslims. And so color in itself was not something that really was a differentiating thing. And, really, color doesn't really become a unifying thing for people of African extraction really until slavery really becomes a major issue. I mean, and this is towards the, weeks later in this class. But, as slavery becomes a big deal, as it becomes clear to people of African extraction that they are seen as less than by other people, whether it's Europeans or whether it's people from the Middle East or whether it's people from East Asia, when it becomes clear to them that they are set apart by other people due to their skin color, then that creates a sense of black unity among black people. And really, a notion of black unity really develops outside of Africa before it comes back to Africa. Because it's the people who are caught up in the slave trade. They're the people who realize that the most. Now, I know I went off topic, but I just want to talk about that because that's something that always comes to the mind of people. Now, let's talk about the slave trade itself. Now, as I said before, Africans were selling other Africans, but really Africans weren't unusual. In Eastern Europe, for instance, or in the Caucasus regions, you know, the modern day areas of, say, Armenia, Georgia, places like Dagestan or Chechnya. These were areas that were kind of backward areas, so to speak, or even in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, in the plains, where you had the Slavic people. I mean, there's a reason the word Slav and slave look almost the same. And that's because Slavs often were targets of the slave trade. And, you know, it's not because the Slavs were dumb. It wasn't because that they were somehow inferior. The thing that hurt them more than anything else is geography. The Slavs lived in wide, flat, open areas where they were farmers. And wide, flat, open areas are areas that are really easy to invade and raid. Now, in Africa, you have a dynamic where the people who tended to be enslaved the most, like, for instance, Eastern Nigeria, a huge percentage of people in the Western Hemisphere of African extraction have ancestry from Eastern Nigeria or Western Cameroon. Now, these areas tended to get targeted a lot for a slave trade because these tended to be societies that were small-scale societies. They didn't have big governments. They had small, a lot of times, societies weren't any bigger than a village or maybe very, very small kingdoms. And that made it easier for people like, say, the folks in Benin and Edo State who were just west of people like the Igbo or Ibibio or some of the other folks who lived further to the east. Those folks had a big empire and they had a big army. And they could come into these smaller places and raid and take folks. And so what you see is that those societies, like, for instance, they talk about the Kingdom of Congo or some of the other kingdoms, they developed big armies. They were able to raid their smaller neighbors and enslave them. And that was no different from people from Persia or Turkey going into the Caucasus or going into Eastern Europe and enslaving people and, you know, making people row the galleys in the Mediterranean or make people be slaves on Madeira or some of the islands in the Western Atlantic to work on sugar plantations. And so it was a very similar dynamic. However, what we see is that Africans get assigned that role in the New World. And ultimately, although it doesn't talk about it in this chapter, slavery becomes racialized. Before long, it is assumed in the Americas that if a person is visibly African, more likely than not, that person is a slave. And so that's the reality of this economic expansion. However, it's important to realize that even with this inferior position that blacks found themselves having in this new economic order, there were black people who benefited. As I said before, you had kingdoms like Ashanti, like Dahomey, like Oyo, that developed during this time. You had traders that made a lot of money. And so even though there was really horrible suffering on the part of those people who were enslaved, there were people who made money. And, you know, you can't lose track of that. Now, there are some other things about this chapter that I think that are important to realize too. And that is that you have trends towards urbanization that continue during this period. And you also have trends of inflation because of all of the injection of precious metal into the economies throughout the world. And so during these centuries, there's a general trend toward inflation. However, because there is such widespread economic growth, and because a lot of people really benefit from it at this time, it doesn't become a major issue. The inflation hurts a lot of people, but really the economic opportunity that's available for people ends up being the driving thing. It ends up being the thing that people notice more than anything else. Well, anyway, I'm going to keep this one kind of short for you. Hope this is helpful. Goodbye.